It was the kind of night that felt written in the stars, the kind that would be replayed in montages for decades. Anfield was alive with electricity, the roar of 54,000 voices creating a symphony of hope and desperation. Liverpool was chasing glory, chasing redemption, chasing a result that would define their season. And in the heart of it all were two men whose fates had been intertwined for years, two pillars of a club that had come to depend on them as much as it depended on the badge itself. Mohamed Salah and Virgil van Dijk, the Egyptian king and the Dutch colossus. Together, they had lifted trophies, conquered Europe, and become legends. But on this particular night, everything that had been built between them would come crashing down in the space of a single moment. A single decision that would ripple through the corridors of Anfield and into the lives of everyone who wore the red shirt. The match itself had been a battle from the first whistle. Manchester City, the reigning champions, had come to Anfield with their usual clinical precision, their passing patterns like a chess game played at the speed of thought. Liverpool had fought back with the intensity that had become their trademark, pressing high, winning the ball in dangerous areas, creating chances that seemed destined to swing the momentum. Salah had been electric, dropping deep to collect the ball, spinning past defenders with that familiar grace, cutting inside from the right wing and testing the goalkeeper with shots that carried the weight of his ambition. Van Dijk, as always, had been the rock at the back, reading the game with the kind of intelligence that made defending look simple, intercepting passes before they became dangerous, organizing the line with calm authority. But as the clock ticked into the final minutes, the score remained locked at 1-1. The tension in the stadium was suffocating. Every touch felt magnified, every mistake potentially catastrophic. Liverpool pushed forward with waves of attack, throwing bodies into the box, desperate for the winner that would keep their title hopes alive. City absorbed the pressure and waited for their moment, the way only the best teams know how to do. And then, in the 89th minute, it happened. A clearance from the Liverpool box fell kindly to a City midfielder just outside the penalty area. He took a touch, looked up, and played a through ball that split the Liverpool defense like a knife through silk. The City striker was through on goal, one-on-one with Alisson, with only Van Dijk between him and glory. This was the moment Van Dijk had been preparing for his entire career. The moment where composure mattered more than pace, where reading the game mattered more than physical strength. He had options. He could hold his position, stay on his feet, force the striker wide, trust Alisson to narrow the angle, or he could commit, step across, try to win the ball cleanly with a perfectly timed challenge. It was a split-second calculation, the kind that defenders make 100 times a match without thinking. But this time, something went wrong. Van Dijk stepped in, lunged for the ball, and mistimed it by the smallest of margins. His trailing leg caught the striker's ankle, and the City forward went down in a heap inside the penalty area. The referee didn't hesitate. His whistle pierced the air, and his arm pointed to the spot. Penalty. The Anfield crowd erupted in protest, but deep down, everyone knew. It was a foul, a clear, undeniable foul. Van Dijk didn't argue. He stood there, hands on his hips, staring at the grass beneath his feet. His face was a mask of controlled devastation, the kind of expression that only comes from knowing you've made a mistake that can't be taken back. Salah was 30 yards away, standing near the halfway line, and when he saw the referee's decision, something inside him fractured. He didn't shout. He didn't throw his hands in the air. He just stood there, frozen, watching as the City players celebrated and prepared for the penalty. His eyes found Van Dijk across the pitch, and for a moment, their gazes locked. There was no anger in Salah's eyes, not yet. There was something worse, disappointment, the kind that cuts deeper than rage ever could. The penalty was converted with ruthless efficiency, 2-1 to City. Liverpool threw everything forward in the dying seconds, but it wasn't enough. The final whistle blew, and the title race that had been so delicately balanced tipped decisively in City's favor. The players trudged off the pitch in silence, the weight of the loss pressing down on their shoulders like lead. In the tunnel, the atmosphere was toxic. No one spoke. No one made eye contact. They moved through the corridors of Anfield like ghosts, each man trapped in his own private hell of what-ifs and regrets. Van Dijk walked with his head down, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter. Salah was a few steps behind, his movements mechanical, his face unreadable. And then, as they reached the door to the dressing room, it happened. Salah stopped. Van Dijk stopped. The other players filed past them, sensing the tension but not daring to intervene. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence between them was heavy, loaded with everything that didn't need to be said. And then Salah leaned in, just close enough for Van Dijk to hear, and whispered something that no one else caught. 7 words. 7 words that would haunt Van Dijk for weeks. 7 words that would change everything between them. The cameras caught the moment, the body language, the intensity of Salah's expression, but the audio was lost in the noise of the tunnel. No one knew what was said, but Van Dijk's face went pale, and something in his eyes died. In the days that followed, the speculation was relentless. Social media exploded with theories and rumors. Lip readers claimed to have deciphered the exchange, but their interpretations varied wildly. Some said Salah had blamed Van Dijk for the loss. Others insisted it was something more personal, something that cut to the core of their friendship. The tabloids ran wild with stories of a dressing room civil war, of factions forming, of a club on the brink of implosion. Liverpool's PR team issued bland statements about professionalism and unity, but no one believed them. The truth was obvious to anyone paying attention. Salah and Van Dijk weren't speaking. In training sessions, they avoided each other with the precision of strangers. On the pitch, their once telepathic understanding seemed to have evaporated. Passes that used to find their target with pinpoint accuracy now went astray. Defensive calls that used to be instinctive now came too late or not at all. The manager tried to intervene. Jurgen Klopp, the emotional heartbeat of the club, pulled both men aside for separate conversations, then together for a mediation that lasted over 2 hours. But whatever had been broken between them wasn't something that could be fixed with words. Klopp emerged from the meeting looking older, more tired, the weight of the situation visible in the lines on his face. The senior players tried as well. Jordan Henderson, the captain, organized a team dinner, hoping that the informal setting might ease the tension. But Salah and Van Dijk sat at opposite ends of the table, barely acknowledging each other's existence. The younger players watched in confused silence, unsure how to navigate the minefield that their team had become. Behind the scenes, the truth was more complicated than anyone outside the dressing room could have guessed. The penalty, the mistake, the loss, those were just the surface. The real fracture had been building for months, a slow accumulation of small resentments and unspoken frustrations that had been papered over by success. Van Dijk had always been the voice of calm authority in the squad, the leader who others looked to in moments of crisis. Salah, meanwhile, had evolved from a brilliant but quiet winger into the team's talisman, the player who carried the goal-scoring burden and the commercial weight of being the club's biggest star. Their roles had shifted, and with those shifts came tension. Van Dijk had made comments in interviews, offhand remarks about how defending was the foundation of any successful team, how Liverpool's identity was built on their defensive solidity. Salah had read between the lines, interpreted those comments as subtle jabs at the attacking players, at him specifically. There had been other moments too. A match earlier in the season where Salah had been caught offside 3 times because Van Dijk's long balls from the back had been played a fraction too late. A tactical meeting where Van Dijk had questioned a high-pressing strategy that left the defense exposed, and Salah had defended it, leading to a tense exchange that others pretended not to notice. A charity event, where Van Dijk had joked about Salah's goal celebrations being too elaborate, and Salah had laughed along but felt the sting beneath the humor. None of these things were enough on their own to break a friendship, but together, accumulated over time, they created fissures. And the penalty, that mistimed tackle in the 89th minute, had been the earthquake that split those fissures wide open. What Salah had whispered in the tunnel wasn't an accusation about the penalty itself. It was something deeper, something that had been festering inside him for months. He had said, "You promised you'd never let me down again." It was a reference to something that had happened years earlier, during Salah's first season back at Liverpool, when Van Dijk had arrived and immediately transformed the defense. There had been a match against Roma, Salah's former club, a match that carried enormous emotional weight for the Egyptian. Liverpool had been winning comfortably, and in the final minutes, Van Dijk had switched off, allowed a Roma forward to score a consolation goal that meant nothing in the context of the tie, but everything to Salah, who had taken it as a personal slight, as if Van Dijk didn't care enough about what the match meant to him. Afterward, in private, Van Dijk had apologized, had promised that he would always give everything, that he would never let Salah down again. It had been a small moment, easily forgotten by anyone else, but Salah had remembered, and when Van Dijk's tackle had given away the penalty that cost them the title race, all of that came flooding back. Van Dijk, for his part, was devastated not just by the mistake, but by the realization of how much it had hurt Salah. He replayed the moment over and over in his mind, analyzing every angle, every decision, trying to understand where it had gone wrong. He had made the tackle because he thought it was the right play, because he believed he could win the ball cleanly, because he was trying to protect the team. But, in hindsight, he could see that staying on his feet would have been the better choice, that forcing the striker wide would have been safer. The mistake itself was forgivable, the kind of error that even the best defenders make. But the context, the timing, the stakes, the weight of the promise he had made years ago turned it into something unforgivable in Salah's eyes. The silence between them stretched on. Days turned into weeks. Liverpool's results suffered. They scraped past lower table teams with narrow victories, dropped points in matches they should have won comfortably, and crashed out of the FA Cup in a lackluster performance that left the fans calling for answers. The media narrative shifted from speculation about the rift to outright criticism of both players. Pundits questioned Van Dijk's concentration, his leadership, his ability to handle pressure. They questioned Salah's maturity, his willingness to put the team first, his commitment to the collective, over individual grievances. The scrutiny was brutal, and it only drove the wedge between them deeper. Inside the training ground, the other players were caught in an impossible position. Some sided with Van Dijk, understanding that mistakes happen, that football is a game of fine margins, that loyalty to a teammate means supporting them through their lowest moments. Others sided with Salah, frustrated by what they saw as Van Dijk's inability to take full responsibility, his tendency to frame the penalty as bad luck rather than a lapse in judgment. The dressing room fractured into camps, not overtly, but in subtle ways. Conversations that used to flow freely became guarded. Jokes that used to lighten the mood fell flat. The unity that had been Liverpool's greatest strength crumbled like sand. And then, on a cold Tuesday evening in early March, something shifted. Liverpool was preparing for a midweek match against a mid-table opponent, a game they were expected to win, but that carried the weight of their recent struggles. The training session had been tense, the drills executed with mechanical precision, but no joy, no spark. As the players filed off the pitch and headed back to the dressing room, Van Dijk made a decision. He pulled Salah aside, away from the others, into a corridor where they wouldn't be overheard. Salah resisted at first, his body language defensive, his expression closed off. But Van Dijk persisted, his voice low and urgent, and eventually Salah stopped trying to walk away. What happened in that conversation? No one else knows for certain. The details remained between them, locked away in the privacy of their reconciliation. But those who saw them emerge said that both men looked different. Van Dijk's shoulders, which had been carrying the weight of guilt and frustration for weeks, seemed lighter. Salah's face, which had been set in stone for so long, had softened. They didn't embrace, they didn't smile, but there was an understanding between them, a recognition that what had been broken could be repaired, even if the scars would remain. The match that followed was unlike anything Liverpool had produced in weeks. From the first whistle, the team moved with a fluidity that had been missing, a cohesion that seemed to flow from the connection between Salah and Van Dijk. Van Dijk commanded the defense with renewed authority, his voice ringing out across the pitch, organizing the line, cutting out danger before it materialized. Salah played with a freedom that had been absent, dropping deep to link play, spinning into space, finishing with the clinical efficiency that had made him one of the deadliest forwards in the world. In the 73rd minute, Van Dijk played a long diagonal ball from deep inside his own half, a perfectly weighted pass that dropped over the opposition defense and into Salah's path. Salah controlled it with his first touch, rounded the keeper with his second, and slotted it into the empty net with his third. As he turned to celebrate, he looked back at Van Dijk, and for the first time in weeks, they made eye contact. Van Dijk raised a fist in acknowledgement, and Salah nodded. It wasn't much, but it was enough. In the weeks that followed, the relationship between them continued to heal. They started speaking again, first in brief exchanges about tactics and positioning, then in longer conversations about life beyond football, about the pressures they both faced, about the expectations that came with being leaders at a club like Liverpool. They would never be as close as they had been before, not in the same way. The penalty, the whispered words in the tunnel, the weeks of silence, those things couldn't be erased. But they found a new kind of understanding, one built not on the assumption of perfection, but on the acceptance of each other's humanity, each other's capacity for mistakes and growth. The media eventually moved on, as it always does, chasing the next controversy, the next scandal, the next narrative to dissect and monetize. But inside Anfield, the story of what had happened between Salah and Van Dijk became part of the club's lore, a reminder that even the strongest relationships can be tested, that even the greatest teams are made up of flawed individuals navigating their own struggles. The younger players learned from it, saw how two legends had faced adversity and found their way back to each other. The coaches learned from it, understood the fragility of team dynamics, the importance of addressing conflicts before they metastasize. And Salah and Van Dijk themselves learned from it, carrying the lessons into the rest of their careers, into the rest of their lives. Years later, when both had moved on from Liverpool, when their playing days were behind them and they were being interviewed for documentaries and retrospectives, they would be asked about that night, about the penalty, about the tunnel, about what was said. And both would smile, a little sadly, a little wistfully, and say the same thing. That football is a game of moments, some glorious and some devastating, and that the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, but how they respond when the mistakes threaten to define them. They would say that what happened between them made them better players, better leaders, better men, and they would leave it at that, the full truth remaining theirs alone, a private chapter in a public story, a reminder that behind every headline and every highlight, there are human beings trying to navigate the impossible pressures of a life lived in the spotlight. The scar remained, of course. In quiet moments, when Van Dijk thought back to that match, to that tackle, he still felt the sting of regret. And when Salah remembered the weeks of silence, the weight of disappointment, he still felt the echo of pain. But they had learned to carry those scars without letting them consume them, to acknowledge the past without being imprisoned by it. And in the end, that was what made their story worth telling. Not because it was a tale of perfect friendship or seamless teamwork, but because it was a story of fracture and repair, of two men who had every reason to let their differences destroy them, but chose instead to find their way back to each other, one difficult conversation at a time. The legacy of that night in the 89th minute wasn't just about a penalty or a loss or a missed opportunity. It was about what came after, about the courage it took to face each other in that corridor, to speak honestly about hurt and frustration and disappointment, about the strength it took to rebuild trust when trust had been shattered, about the recognition that being teammates, being brothers in the truest sense, meant weathering storms together, not abandoning each other when the seas got rough. And for everyone who wore the Liverpool shirt after them, for everyone who looked up at the photos in the corridors of Anfield and saw Salah and Van Dijk standing side by side, hoisting trophies and celebrating victories, the story served as a reminder that greatness isn't just about talent or trophies or moments of individual brilliance. It's about resilience. It's about forgiveness. It's about choosing every single day to fight for something bigger than yourself, even when it would be easier to walk away.